Production support for InFocus is provided by Smithville, a locally owned business serving central and southern Indiana since 1922 with residential and business internet, voice, and security services. Smithville, local pride, global technology. Information at smithville.net. Hoosier Energy, providing electricity for central and southern Indiana electric cooperatives and their member customers. Information at hepn.com. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Late last year, Bloomington was gripped by a series of crimes against the city's Jewish community. But South Central Indiana isn't the only area fighting anti-Semitism. An audit provided by the Anti-Defamation League reports that in 2009 there were more than 400 such vandalism cases nationwide, including rocks thrown through synagogue windows, anti-Semitic graffiti, and attacks on Jewish cemeteries. Tonight we'll discuss these issues and others as we put tolerance and diversity in focus. Thanks for joining us for the beginning of Season 3 of In Focus. I'm Stan Jastrzebski. If you have questions for one of our studio experts during tonight's program, please email us at infocus@indiana.edu or call us at 1-800-987-9848. According to the latest FBI statistics, in 2009 there were more than 8,000 hate crimes in the U.S., including more than 4,000 committed because of racial bias and 1,500 religious crimes. WTIU's Shamika Neely has more.
The most recent statistics from the Anti-Defamation League show more than 1,200 anti-Semitic events occurred around the country in 2009. In December, police investigations led to the arrest of an IU staff member who's accused of committing anti-Semitic acts in Monroe County. Members of local religious groups, community organizations, and city officials responded with a message of respect and tolerance. Together, they formed the group Bloomington United to ensure the values of the city would be upheld.
This coalition of community members came together to say, basically, not in our yards. We don't want this in our yards. We don't want it in our towns. We don't want it anywhere. Most people understand that communities have issues. I think what it has done, though, it has changed the way we view ourselves. I think there was a time when people who lived in Bloomington thought that we were this haven in the Midwest, and so now we're understanding that we do have some of the same issues that other communities have, and so maybe we're not as removed from the rest of the world as maybe we thought we were.
We see maybe fewer incidents of racism or even anti-Semitism, but then you get, one of these very nasty incidents, and it just makes you realize this is an ongoing issue. I think it's so important that we address these things when they happen, but I think it's the nature of human beings that, prejudices continue, and it's just an ongoing issue. So I don't have an easy answer to that.
Calendar Anderson says finding ways to respond to incidents should be something that is done 365 days a year, while she says education, creative innovation, and community support change begins with oneself.
The other thing is to continue to live our values, to continue to live out that value of acceptance and diversity and nonviolence and appreciation. And so I think that as individuals, that's what we do. We do that in our homes, we do that in our workplaces, we do that in our communities of faith. So those are things we do individually. As organizations, we can make sure that we continue that acceptance of diversity in our organizations and make our organizations and our workplaces open for people of different races and nationalities and sexual orientation. I mean, so it's just making sure that we're talking and we're listening, and that we're changing what needs to be changed in order to make everybody feel welcome.
Anti-Semitism has plagued the world for centuries. Tonight we'll discuss how and if it has changed the reputation of Bloomington. Plus we'll talk about acceptance and equality amongst various groups as we put tolerance and diversity in focus.
Good evening. I'm Sarah Whitmire. I'm joined on the phone by Jonathan Bernstein. Jonathan is the executive director of Not in Our Town. So Jonathan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. If we're not in our town, you go around the country and go to different cities and talk about ways to prevent intolerance. So why did you choose Bloomington as one of these cities?
Well, our basic mission is to highlight communities that are coming together to stop hate. And Bloomington really kind of showed us how it's done. And so what we have found is that when we find stories like this of people coming together and saying, not in our town, speaking out against a hate crime, supporting the victim and the victim's community, when we tell stories about that, it can be a real inspiration to other people from other communities to learn about what they can do to put a stop to hatred.
Now, is it easier to talk about intolerance in a place like Bloomington in a college town?
Why do you ask? Why specifically a college town?
Because it seems like a more diverse population in a college town, generally speaking.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I think we'll see hatred cropping up anywhere. It's all across the country, in every state, and I don't really think that there's more hatred in certain geographic areas. What we have found, though, is that there tends to be a more vigorous, more effective response in more rural kinds of areas, not in the big cities.
Okay, not in our town seems like you don't just target bigger issues like racism and diversity, but you also talk about things like bullying, and I noticed this week it's name calling. So how do you affect change in those specific areas?
Well, I mean, the key is for people to develop relationships with other people who are different from themselves, who come from different backgrounds, who speak different languages, and to invite those kinds of people into your home and embrace them. And when people are developing those kinds of personal relationships with other people who are different from themselves, they're more inclined to be affected when a person from that culture, that background, is being targeted, and to speak up against it. So that would apply whether we're talking about a serious hate crime or maybe a more simple bullying incident.
What are some of the major lessons, maybe that say that when you said Bloomington is a perfect example of how they responded to it, what are some of the major things that you really pick up here that then you can take to other communities and say, this is the way they responded?
Right. Well, I think one thing that seems key for us is to not come up with some kind of prescriptive sort of formula that you need to implement in order to have an effective response. These things tend to be more, developed on a grassroots level, and kind of and speak to whatever's going on in that town or that community. And so it's better to sort of leave it a little bit open, but to give people guidance on what they can do. And so just by telling the stories of what happened in Bloomington, the fact that the town came together for a menorah lighting after the rocks were thrown through the windows at the Hillel House and at Chabad, that people wore blue, that there were just that they put menorahs up in their windows. All of these things were developed there, right in Bloomington, and so it wasn't like some outside organization from somewhere else came along and said, here's what you need to do. This was developed by your neighbors, by your friends, and so I think it feels more real to the victims when that happens, and also the people who are putting it on embrace it more easily, and it spreads, so a lot more people, grab hold of it.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight, Jonathan. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have.